Well, I greet you all in the name of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, who overcame the grave in the glorious resurrection. And we celebrated his new life yesterday, and that new life will carry us right on through this next year. Newness of life is promised to us in the resurrection of our Lord. Rusty Savage has been our teacher for the last 2 months and has agreed to come and help us again in developing and cultivating the rich life, the fullness of life of our pastoral leadership and other leadership in the church. Thank you for being our teacher, Rusty. However, I'm sorry that you had to make this presentation when you were not well. And I've been praying that your sickness could be overcome. And it's still in the process of being overcome. And we're grateful for that. So let's begin with a word of prayer. All-powerful, eternal God, we are overwhelmed by your awesome love and power and might revealed to us supremely in the resurrection of Jesus Christ. We are humbled before you and deeply grateful that we have the new life of our risen Lord and that we can experience that as our own. That we can not only experience it personally, but then we can share with others the truth that you live. May our lives be living testimonies of your unconquerable love. Now, as we share together in this class, we ask that you'll guide Rusty Savage as he guides us in living in the newness of Christ. And as you guide him, we ask that you would give him full healing and health in his body after having undergone a severe case of the flu. So thank you for being with us, Rusty. Rusty knows the life of the church leader. Rusty spent many years in his adult life, particularly as a lead pastor in a friend's church and as a youth pastor. He knows the challenges, he knows the stresses, as well as the joys of church leadership. He's equipped to help us who are church leaders in our institute to find ways to enhance our spiritual, emotional, family, physical health, health in the community. He understands us in our responsibilities as church leaders. He realizes that, as we all do in the many nations being represented around the world, that a healthy church must have healthy leaders, and he's here to help us do that. Rusty has spoken directly to our needs in the past 2 sessions, and we're looking forward to what you have to share again this evening, Rusty. Thank you for being with us. And if you need me to assist in sharing the screen, let me know, but let me double check to make sure that the recorder is working. It is. All right. Go ahead and share your screen, Rusty.
Okay. All right, should be up there now. Does everybody see it okay?
Yeah, yeah, we can
It's
see
clear.
okay.
Yes.
And Rusty, I'm going to go to my other computer and I'm going to mute this main mic because I want to help a couple other people get online.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Dr. Kingery, so much. Well, it's great to be back with you guys again tonight. I just want to tell you how much I've enjoyed being able to share this time with you over the past couple of months and talk about the personal life and health of a church leader. I hope it's been helpful to you in some ways. If not, it's at least been helpful to me to go through some of these things and kind of evaluate my own life and ministry, my own heart, and think about things that I ought to be doing and that I am doing, that I want to do to be as healthy of a church leader as I can possibly be. I wanted to begin tonight by going back to the passage that I started with when we began our time together. Except my screen is not advancing. There we go. From 1 Timothy 4:16, where Paul says to a young church leader in Timothy, gives him this admonition: watch your life and doctrine closely. Persevere in them, because if you do, you will save both yourself and your hearers. And that was the first verse I shared with you. That's kind of been, I guess, maybe the core of what I've tried to think about as we put these classes together. Merle and I were talking just a little bit together before everybody was here online, and both of us had the same experience as we were in our formal studies for, seminary studies. The focus for us was on watching our doctrine, learning the Bible, learning theology, important things and good things, but really not any classes or a lot of instruction about how to watch your life well as a pastor or as a church leader. And so that's really what this class has been to focus on. And one of the things that I want to remind you about as we think about Paul's words here to young Timothy is that what we've been talking about in terms of our own personal health as church leaders is not only for our own benefit. Surely is in part to benefit our hearts, our lives, ourselves. But what Paul says to Timothy is that this is also for your hearers. This is for those that have been entrusted into your care, that you are ministering to. The best thing that we can give to them is a life that's fully devoted to Jesus. That's the absolute best thing that we can give to the people that have been entrusted to our care. So the first couple times together, we focused on different aspects of our personal life and health. The first night, we talked about personal life and health of the church leader with God and how we relate to God and how that affects the way that we do ministry, how we think about ministry conceptually. It all comes out of how we view God and how we relate to Him. And then the second night, thinking about the personal life and the health leader of the church leader at home, and how we relate to our family, our wives, our husbands, as the case may be, to our children, to those that we live with. Tonight, what I want to focus on is the personal life and health of the church leader in community. And when I say in community, I don't mean in the neighborhoods in which you live. So I'm not talking about outreach here. I'm thinking rather about those that you are living your life in community with. So I'm thinking about the ways that we have relationships with the people in our churches, the ways that we relate to colleagues in ministry, the ways that we relate to our brothers and sisters in the faith, and how essential those relationships are to our own healthy ministries. So really, all three of these nights, if you think about it, have all been about relationships. First night being primarily about our relationship with God. The second night being about our relationship with our families. And then tonight thinking about our relationship with brothers and sisters and how that is so important to our own ministries. And I'll kind of begin tonight, I guess, with a cautionary tale. Most of you probably know this man, Ravi Zacharias. I don't go through all this because I want to be critical of any individual, but rather because it's a story that most of us would probably be familiar with and one that can perhaps be instructful to our own lives and ministries. But Ravi Zacharias, of course, was a very gifted, noted apologist and teacher of the faith, traveled widely, wrote widely, was very helpful to many, many people in churches. He was helpful to me. He's been helpful to me in my own faith over the years. And since his death, there's been quite a bit of stories that have come out about ways that perhaps he was not watching his life the way that he should have. And those have been pretty devastating for me to honestly to hear about the duplicity that was there and the hiddenness and I know it's been pretty devastating for other people to think about a man that had such incredible giftedness in ministry, in such an effective ministry in so many ways, who fell in a very public way, and then the impact that has, the ripple effect that has on so many other people. But here's the point: as the stories have continued to come out about what seems like it really did happen in his ministry, there's three things that just seem to be repeated over and over again that I've noticed as I've been reading and processing through some of that. And those three things are that throughout his ministry, or at least in the latter part of his ministry, he was very isolated from people, very isolated. He tended to, because he had to travel a lot, he tended to be alone a lot. If he did travel with others, they were perhaps assistants that were not really involved too much in his life. And so there was a great deal of isolation there. Second thing was that there was a disconnectedness from the church, from any kind of local church, again, because the nature of his ministry and the traveling and things, it seems as though he really was not connected to a local body of believers very, very well. And then the third thing is that there seemed to have been a lack of accountability with any brothers or sisters, really nobody that had the permission to speak into his life and to ask him the tough questions and to hold him accountable to the things that God has called us to be about. And those three things, I think, formed the kind of perfect storm that allowed some of the things to take place that did. But it's certainly not, it's not just in this particular man's ministry. Those three things of being isolated, being unaccountable, and being disconnected from the church are dangerous for everyone, not just for celebrity pastors. We might think that it only goes for those that are up on the big stage and maybe farther away from the local church, but someone in ministry at any level can live and do ministry in a way that's isolating from people, that doesn't allow others to hold him accountable, and that keeps him really disconnected from the church. Of course, as believers, we know this isn't the way that God created us to function. It's not the way he created us to live, and it's certainly not the way that he created us to do ministry with Jesus. Go back all the way to the creation story in the beginning. In Genesis 2:18, we read these words, "It is not good for man to be alone," from the mouth of God. Of course, you think about the creation story, all that God had created was good. It was good. It was good. We hear that refrain over and over throughout the creation account. It is good. What God has done is good. Everything was in harmony. Everything was in shalom. And the only thing in this pre-fall world in Genesis that we see being described as not good is the isolation of Adam, his aloneness, his lack of relationship with other people. Because he had been created in the image of God, he was created for relationship. And that one part of his life, God says, was not good. It wasn't good for him to be alone. And so, of course, God creates a partner for Adam. And what was true of Adam is true for all of us. It's been true for all people since that time. It's true for every pastor, every church leader, every person who has responsibility in the church. It's not good for us to live our lives alone. But the point that I really want us to think about together tonight is it's not good for us to do ministry alone. It's not good for us to have an isolated, alone kind of Lone Ranger ministry. I read an article a while back called The Lonely American, not from a Christian source. It was in the National Review. But think about these words that this reporter, this is how he opened his story. He says, "What is America's most pressing social problem? Depending on whom you ask, you'll get different answers. Secularization, racial discrimination, long-term unemployment, drugs, technological stagnation, family breakdown, cultural decline. All of these are serious ills, but I would like to submit a different answer, one linked to all of the above, one that gets virtually no public attention: loneliness. And he goes on in the article to talk about this sort of epidemic of isolation that we are experiencing in our culture right now. And this was written, I think it was 2013, so it was 8 years ago. But he gives several statistics of the ways that so many Americans live disconnected lives, how few Americans have friends that they trust, that they talk to on a regular basis, how few Americans are connected to any sort of community groups, including churches. He talks about not only that this is true at large in America, but it's particularly true among American men, that this isolation, this loneliness, this lack of real friendships is particularly true among men. And I believe that. I've seen that as I've pastored churches, that many men in the church have no one, perhaps other than their wife, that they really talk to, that they have these kinds of deep friendships with. And of course, this has just been made all the more true during this period of COVID, right? The isolation that was already there has been exacerbated. The loneliness that people were experiencing is even greater than before. Social media, I think, contributes to that as well. There's just a lack of deep, real relationships all around us, to the point that even secular journalists like this one that wrote this article, The Lonely American, are taking note of this. Or you may remember a very well-known sociology book that was written a few years ago called Bowling Alone. That was about the same thing, just a friendless, isolated American. Again, not written by a Christian, written by a secular person, but that was just noting that something's wrong. Something's wrong in the way that so many people seem to be so alone. And here's my greater concern as we talk together tonight. Not just that this is true in the culture around us, but that this is true in the ministry. And I would even argue that this is particularly true among church leaders for lots of reasons. We'll go back to one of the statistics that I shared with you on our first night together from David Williams' book, Rhythms of Grace. And one of the things that David points out is that according to polls, 70% of pastors do not have someone they consider a close friend. 70%, 7 out of 10 pastors don't have anyone that they really feel like that they can confide in. And I do think that that is more true of people in church leadership even than in the general population. And there's probably lots of reasons for that. A man named Arthur Boers, in his article, Everyone's Pastor, No One's Friend, it was an article in Christianity Today, he tried to outline some of the reasons why people in church leadership struggle to have deep, real friendships with other people. And here's some of the things that he noted. Number one, a lot of church leadership and ministry requires us to work alone, especially if you're a solo pastor. You're doing a lot of things alone. You're in your study alone. You're preparing your message alone. You're traveling to be with your people alone. You're setting your own schedule. You're making your own plans. You do a lot of your work alone, and that contributes to a lot of the isolation that I think a lot of pastors experience. Second thing he notes is a lack of reciprocation. So he talks about in that article that, you know, as a pastor or as a church leader, you have a defined role that people look to you in order to fulfill. So when people come to you, oftentimes they have certain expectations of what they want out of that relationship, and it's built upon the role that you have as a church leader. And that is good in that it opens up doors and opportunities for ministry, but it can sometimes, I think, make friendships difficult or make community life difficult for the person that's in the role of the church leader, because there's not a corresponding role in the other person that allows them to know that you want more than just to pour into them, but you need friendship and relationship from others. The third one is playing the role of the pastor. So number 2 has to do with other people's expectations, but number 3, he's talking about the expectations that we have. A lot of times, one of the reasons I think we struggle, church leaders struggle to live out their lives and do ministry in community is because they're constantly kind of going into this pastoral role with people where they're not looking to them as friends. They're not looking to them as partners. They're not looking to them as co-workers, but rather they're looking to them as those that they must help and they must minister to and they must give to. And so it's hard sometimes for people that are in church leadership to move beyond that sort of role of the pastor that they're so used to being in order to have the kind of vulnerability that it requires to really live life in community with other people as a person, as a follower of Jesus. Number 4, he talks about in this article, one of the reasons that church leaders struggle to have these kinds of relationships is because of our own frailties. And he gives an example of that kind of hit home with me. He talked about he had gone out to dinner. Excuse me. He'd gone out to dinner, he and his wife, with a couple of families from the church, a couple other couples from the church. And at some point during the dinner, he got frustrated about something. He kind of snapped at his wife. And he talked about the humiliation and the embarrassment that he felt, that here were these people from the church and they'd seen him, he'd lost his cool and he had just been kind of impolite to his wife, and how he didn't want to put himself in any kind of position where people could see him being less than what he wanted them to see him as their pastor. In other words, he didn't want to allow his own frailties or his own sinfulness to be seen by others. And so he isolated himself from others. And I think that's an all too common kind of response from people in church ministry, that we don't want to be authentic enough to have real friendships with people because we believe that they expect something different from us. And then number 5, he talked about just isolation from extended family, which is so often goes along with ministry. Oftentimes, when we take on a church leadership role, a ministry role, we find ourselves living in a community that we're not from, that we don't have family members in. And it can contribute to a sense of isolation and to aloneness. And so every vocation and every calling has its own unique challenges to the kind of community life that Jesus calls us to. But there are some that are unique to church leadership. And these are some of them that I think we need to be mindful of. As I was thinking about this list, I realized there's one for me that has been a real challenge sometimes to really making community an important part or a priority in my ministry that wasn't on his list. And I was trying to think of how to describe it to you guys. Maybe some of you can relate to it, but it was like, it basically had to do with just feeling exhausted. And what I mean by that is really, I'm an introvert by nature and temperament. I always have been. And yet I'm in a calling and feel that the Lord has put me in a place where I'm often asked to be very extroverted and very involved in high relational ministry with people. And I love that. And I'm thankful that the Lord has allowed me to do that. But the truth is it's very draining on me. And there's days when I come home after being with people all day in counseling situations, or if I'm teaching, or just in the hospital with folks, and I just don't want to talk anymore, and I just don't want to be around people anymore. And often I would find myself kind of isolating myself from opportunities to spend time with people as friends, or to be involved in groups of people that were not ministry settings, but just opportunities to be around other people, because I just felt so exhausted of people. And some of that was for my own well-being, I guess. I know the way that I need to recharge, and often it's not by being with a lot of people. It usually involves, just a good book and being alone for a while. But it also kind of became a habit that became a bad habit. that because I often felt drained from being around people, it became much easier for me to just isolate myself from people anytime I had an opportunity. And I really had to push myself to be involved in things that I wasn't required to be at, but I just knew I needed to be at. So, for example, there was a small group that my wife and I were involved in for many years, and I avoided going for a long time because I'd say, well, I've just been with people all day, honey. I'm tired. I just would rather relax. Every time I went, I had to push myself to go. Every time that I went, I came home blessed and knowing that it was the right thing for me to do. Now, that doesn't mean I was in another group every night. I had to set those limits, but I needed to push myself to form those relationships. And now, on my desk at work, at my office, I have two pictures on my desk. One is of my family, and the other one is a picture of that life group that we were together with them for years. And those people have become so precious to me. We went through a lot of life together and a lot of difficult things together. And it was because really I had to push myself to make that a priority, to spend time with them. So lots of reasons why there's challenges to the kind of community life that we have in mind, but even more reasons why we know that this is so important to ministry. And the main reason we know this is because we know who our God is. And our God is, by his very nature, a relational being, isn't he? For all eternity, our God has been Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And for all eternity, he's been involved in this divine dance of relationship, the Father loving the Son, and the Son loving the Spirit, and the Spirit loving the Father, so that God is in nature, and he's created us in his image to be like him, that God works in relationship. And we need to work in relationship. And not only do we have the example of the Trinity, but we have the example of Jesus. Excuse me. The way that Jesus did ministry. Jesus did ministry with people. He also made time for solitude. He also made time to be alone with the Father. He also practiced extended periods of prayer and fasting where he was off in the wilderness by himself. But he always came back to community. He always came back to people that he did ministry with, that he invited them to do ministry beside him. And I think when we think about Jesus and his interaction with the community that he had around him, his disciples, we think about a setting like this, this painting of the Last Supper, where, Jesus is kind of holding court and teaching in maybe a very formal way. But as you read the Gospels, this isn't the image that I see. I see an image more like this. As you read the Gospels and you read about the way that Jesus interacted with the disciples and did life with the disciples and did ministry with the disciples, this seems like more of a picture of what it was like. I picture a lot of laughter. I picture a lot of camaraderie. I picture a lot of fun and a lot of deep friendships between Jesus and his disciples. And as you read the gospel accounts about Jesus, there's some things about the way that Jesus did ministry that start to come out. Number one, you notice that Jesus was very intentional about creating community wherever he went, right? When it was time to choose the disciples, he spent a night in prayer with the Father, and then he called them personally, called them by name to come and be with him, to come and be a part of this new community that he was forming. And he did this wherever he went. He was often in people's homes, at their tables, with others. The second thing you notice about Jesus is that he shared not only his greatest joys, but his deepest sorrows with people. He invited them into his life in a very real way. Jesus did not isolate himself. So you think about, the greatest joys, you think about the transfiguration and how Jesus invited certain of those disciples that he was very close to come with him onto that mountaintop and share in that experience. And then you think on the other side about his deepest sorrows. You think about him at the garden pleading with his friends. Can you not keep watch with me for 1 hour? Can you not pray with me? And Jesus bearing his soul to them, telling them about how he was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Jesus shared his life with these men. He didn't hide his greatest triumphs, his deepest sorrows from them. And then the third thing that you notice about Jesus's ministry and community is that Jesus shared deep relationships with the same people over an extended period of time. These men that he called to be with him were with him for the years of his public ministry. You see his deep friendship with Mary and Martha and Lazarus that goes on for years. And I say that because one of the ways that we often isolate ourselves in ministry is that we build friendships with people that we know will be temporary, so that we don't have to be too vulnerable, so that we don't have to be too honest, so that we don't have to be too open and too accountable. We can have friendships, but we know that we'll move away from those and onto others. When we really share our lives with people and invite them to do ministry alongside us, to the point that we are accountable to them, it takes place over the long haul. And that's what creates the kind of vulnerability that's necessary to have the kind of ministry that Jesus calls us to. So I think this is a true statement that Dave Barringer said Satan works in isolation, God works in community. And as I think about, again, as I think about a lot of my own friends and colleagues who have fallen away from their ministries, or who have found themselves in great tragedies of their own making in life, almost always it happens in isolation. It doesn't happen in community. It happens in hiddenness. It happens when we don't allow others to keep us accountable and to do ministry beside us. So that's why we're talking about what we're talking about tonight. And what I want to show you in the time we have together then is I'm going to talk about 7 relationships that every church leader needs. 7 relationships that I think if you're going to be in ministry, you need to have these relationships in your ministry, no matter who you are or how long you've been doing it. So that's what I'm going to talk about, but maybe I'll pause for just a second because I'm doing a lot of talking and you guys are having to, unfortunately, just do a lot of listening to me. So let me pause for a second. Are there any questions or comments or insights that anybody would like to share with the group?
Brad Wood here. I just wondering if this is more of an American phenomena than a worldwide phenomena in pastoral work. If there are differences between in other countries, what people face. The reason why I say that is I had a family that came from Mexico, and they just noticed a difference in America, how people are so much more isolated than they were where they grew up in Mexico, and so I think I was just wondering some of those differences are they things that we deal with as Americans more so than others, or is it true everywhere?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Brad. And actually, I know Diotne and Desire and Ernest are on the call with us, and Caleb Tamang is with us too. And I'd love to hear from you guys. I think my answer to Brad would be yes. I think this is particularly true here in America. But I'd want to hear from you guys. Have you seen these same kinds of problems of isolation and loneliness in ministry, or have you seen something different?
Can I start?
Yes, please, Yodne.
Actually, during my childhood, because there was no other communication like cell phone, computer, these things that they use today, this problem didn't happen. But as and about maybe 1980, since people start to have other way of communication and to be busy with maybe this new kind of life, isolation started to be created among them. Up to this 2000, this kind of isolation has place even in Africa. But before this problem didn't happen. People were connected together all the time, visiting each other, uh, working in a group, but things have changed, which means that we have the same problem now.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, Yodne. Yeah. How about some of the others of you that have come here from other countries? What have been some of your experiences with the things that we're talking about tonight?
Just want to agree what Diodone said. I think there is, I don't have much experience because I came here when I was little. So, but when I came here, it's kind of a little bit different than where we used to be back home. Because I think people are more connected, and I don't know, we used to have like more time together and visit each other, church all the time. But here it's totally different because I think maybe time and the way people cultures. I think that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. Thanks, Desire. I think that word that you use, time, is one of the key reasons why, at least here in America, we particularly struggle sometimes with isolation from one another. Relationships take time. Real relationships take time. And the kind of friendships that are capable of producing real accountability take time. And we often just don't make the time for it. And we're so busy and so rushed and so driven by our calendars that often I think that contributes to our isolation. Anybody else?
Hi, this is Caleb. Yeah, mostly what I experience here in America, that mostly the people of our community, especially Bhutanese, Nepali speaking people, we are new to this country, and mostly in our back home country, we used to have interaction or go to visit most of the time. We did not feel isolated. But here, mostly, especially the pastors and leaders, we feel isolation most of the time because we don't get connected with church members. We have to, when we visit them, they are very busy sometimes, and we don't meet quite often because of the job. And sometimes because of all these things, we feel most of the time isolation. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Caleb.
My parents came to the United States to do ministry, and they realized that there was a big difference in the cultures and just being together with people. Also, coming to the bigger cities caused more isolation as well. Just being, you have to consider that the people maybe that you're ministering to, that you're building relationships with, they live 15, 20 minutes away from your home. And so you have to plan around that as well. And some of their ministries in their countries, Guatemala and Honduras, they're small towns or small villages. And so people were everybody walked. And so it was easier for them to have people around more often. So that was a change for them as well. So, and the job situation too, with the people that they were reaching out to in one particular town when they started the church plant, they had to ask people when is a good time to come, because they couldn't just decide to come whenever they wanted to because people were sleeping. Maybe they worked, or they were at work because they're at second shift, and all of that. So there was a lot of times that they faced, isolation due to the different schedules that people had and the kind of schedule they were trying to have.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there are a lot of challenges, and you guys you're highlighting the challenges that we face. So I think the word that we have to focus on when we think about doing ministry in community with others is intentionality. In other words, we will be as isolated as we choose to be. There's a lot of things that will contribute to that, and we can just let that happen, or we can be intentional about saying there's a better way to live and there's a better way to do ministry, and it looks like the way Jesus did ministry. And but you have to be intentional, and every one of these 7 relationships that I'm going to talk about here, it will take intention on our part to seek out people to fill these roles in our lives. Rarely, I think, will it just happen. Sometimes it does. Sometimes we're blessed with that. Most of the time, it's a matter of us being intentional about finding these 7 relationships that we'll talk about. So let's at least start into these 7 relationships here before we take our first break. And here's the first one. So 7 relationships every church leader needs. The first relationship I think every church leader needs is a Paul. You need a Paul in your life. So I'm going to follow the same basic structure for all 7 of these relationships. I'm going to give you a biblical character, kind of a descriptive word, and then the question that goes with it. And then we're going to look at some scripture passages together to help us understand what this involves or what this looks like in ministry. So everyone in church leadership ought to have a Paul. And what I mean by that is someone that would be considered a mentor to you, someone that you are able to watch, to look to learn from. And of course, we see that in Paul's ministry in many ways. Paul was very good at taking young men into his life and ministry and helping to raise them up as leaders. People like Timothy or Titus or John Mark or others. Paul was a mentor to so many people. So the question is, who are you watching? Who are you watching that's teaching you how to do ministry? I know Dr. Kingery has talked several times in my presence about Elton Trueblood and how Elton Trueblood was a mentor to him, someone that he looked to and learned from. And we all need an Elton Trueblood in our life, or a Paul. And so let's look at a couple of these passages that kind of lay out what I mean by a mentor. So 2 Timothy 3:10. The context is that Paul is writing about false teachers, about those that would lead the church into heresy or disunion or discord. And much of 1st and 2nd Timothy has to do with avoiding these false teachers. But then in 2 Timothy chapter 3, he contrasts what he's been talking about in the lives of these false teachers with these words that he writes to Timothy. He says, "You, however, know all about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance." So here's Paul talking to one of these young men that he is discipling, that he has mentored, that he is investing his life in. And he says, Timothy, you know about my way of life. You know about my faith. You know about my patience. You know about my endurance. Well, how can Paul say this to Timothy? He can say this because he had invited Timothy to watch him and learn from him. And no matter what stage of ministry we're in, I'm just convinced we need a Paul in our lives. And we need to be intentional about it. We need to know who our Pauls are. Maybe it's more than one, often it is. But the people that we're looking to and watching and learning how, not only to do ministry, but how to walk with Jesus. Whether this is our first year of ministry or it's our 40th year of ministry, I think we all need a Paul. One of the passages that illustrates to me Paul's example as a mentor to others is 1 Corinthians 11:1, where he makes this fairly remarkable statement, I think. He says to the church, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." Watch me as I walk with Jesus. Now, on the one hand, I think sometimes we read that and it strikes some people as it almost sounds of hubris, right? That how could you say, "Watch me, follow my example as I follow the example of Christ"? Or we think, I could never say that to someone. I would never tell them to look to me. But I hear this, and I hear a loving father saying to his kids, "Watch me and I'll show you how to do this," right? What a blessing to have people in our lives who can take on this mantle that Paul had in the lives of so many others, to be those that we watch. So I think about my son Henry. For his last birthday, he had been working for a year to convince us that for his birthday, he needed a BB gun. He just turned 9 and he wanted a BB gun. And he had been talking about this for a year. And so his mom and I talked, and we finally got him his BB gun, and he was so excited. And when he got his BB gun, I didn't just hand him the BB gun and then tell him, here's the rules. Here's how you use it. Here's the safety rules. Okay, go out in the backyard and use it. I took him out in the backyard and I said to him, "Now watch me. Watch how I do this. Watch how I handle it. Watch how I load the BB gun. Watch where I point the barrel. Watch how I make sure that none of your siblings are behind your target. Watch how I do this." I invited him to watch me. That's what a mentor does. And I think about in my own life, when I was in college, someone that became a mentor to me was my theology professor, a man named Dr. Maroney. And he was a great teacher. And I learned a lot from him. I'd had him in several classes. He was one of my favorite teachers, but I didn't really know him outside of the classroom. I just listened to his lectures and learned from him. And one day, probably my second year there, after class, everyone was filing out of the room, and he asked me to stay behind. And he said, "I've invited 2 other theology students to join me in a discipleship group, and I wondered if you would be the third." And I took him up on it. And every week we met in his office and we read together through Kent Hughes' Disciplines of a Godly Man. I don't know if you've read that one. It's a great book if you haven't. I still have the copy that we read together and the notes that I took with him. But beyond that, he would often invite me to his home, the 3 of us, these 3 students. And that's really where he became a mentor to me. It wasn't so much what he taught me in the classroom, and it wasn't even so much what we learned going through that book together. It was rather when he'd have the 3 of us over to his house for dinner, and we would watch the way that he would interact with his wife. We would watch the way that he spoke to her. We would watch the way he treated his kids. We would watch the way he'd respond when he'd lose at ping pong or some other game that we were playing together. We saw him living out his faith, and he wasn't just a teacher in front of the room anymore. He was a man who was walking with Jesus, and he became a mentor to me and remained so for a long time. And we need those mentors in our life. We all need a Paul. Here's a verse that struck me the other day with newfound power that I'd never thought of before, just in the simplicity of the way the NIV states this. This is John 3:22. It just says, "After this, Jesus and his disciples went out into the Judean countryside where he spent some time with them." Just the simplicity of that statement, where Jesus spent some time with them. That's what mentoring looks like, right? It looks like spending time with someone. And I learned something about this particular verse. The word that the NIV translates as "spend time" is this Greek word diatribo. And it comes from these 2 root words, dia, which means against, and tribo, which means to rub. And so it's this idea that when you spend time with a person the way that Jesus was spending time with these disciples, you start to rub off on them. That's what mentors do in our lives. And we all need a Paul in our lives. So my question to you is, who's your Paul? Who are the people that you're looking to? And if there's no one in your mind right now that you can think of, then we go back to that word intentionality, right? Who are you going to find to be your Paul? And I hope that when we finish up tonight, you can go through each of these 7 relationships and you can look at each one and say, yeah, that's my Paul, and that's my Barnabas, and that's my Timothy, that you know who these people are in your life. So who's your Paul? Who are you watching as you do ministry? Number 2, every church leader needs a Barnabas in your life. So we all need a Paul, we all need a Barnabas. Barnabas is a partner in ministry. The question is, who are you working beside? So again, thinking of Paul and Barnabas were partners in ministry. They were down in the trenches together. They were rolling up their sleeves and getting to work together, side by side. We need those kinds of relationships in ministry. Often, I have found them with other pastors. You know, in my role as a pastor, where I found the Barnabases in my life, it's been with other pastors by building those kinds of intentional relationships with them. But not always. It's also been a lot of people in my own church who have just been there to work in ministry beside me, that I count on, that I look to. Barnabas and Paul had the kind of relationship that really began as more of a mentor and a disciple. But it was Barnabas discipling Paul, right? You think about early on in Paul's ministry, when the church was afraid of him. They didn't know what to make of this Saul who had converted, or said he converted, this man who had persecuted the church. The believers were afraid. It was Barnabas who stood up and said, no, this guy's all right. This is real. What Jesus has done in his life, it's real. You think about Barnabas going and finding Paul and bringing him back to Antioch so that he could work with Barnabas in ministry there. Barnabas was really the mentor to Paul for a while, but their relationship changed to the point that they became partners. And one of the passages that kind of spells this out for us is this passage here, which says, now in the church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers. And it lists all of these different prophets and teachers there. Who had, verse 2, while they were worshiping the Lord and fasting, the Holy Spirit said, set apart for me Barnabas and Saul for the work to which I have called them. So after they had fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on them and they sent them off. So this great picture of the church at Antioch, where Paul and Barnabas have been laboring together as partners in ministry, and the Holy Spirit calling these 2 men and saying, set apart for me these partners in ministry, Barnabas and Saul, and they left to go out in this work together. Who are your Barnabases in ministry? One of the great tragedies of pastoral ministry for many people is the kind of Lone Ranger mentality, where they're basically doing it on their own, or at least trying to. Usually not doing it well, but they're trying to do it all on their own. Who are the people that are going to go down into the trenches with you and go to work? As I think about my own life, there was a guy named Brian in my church, and Brian was just the kind of guy that every pastor would pray for. He wanted to serve. Every time he saw you, how can I help? What can I do? And that was just his heart. And I knew that if I needed help, if I needed somebody to go with me on a tough visit, if I needed somebody to be with me in a tough situation, I could pick up the phone, I could call Brian, and he was going to be there. And then Brian left me and went down to Atlanta to help Diodne start his church down there. So now he's partners with Diodne down there. But we need Brians in our lives and ministries. We need a Barnabas. And again, it happens with intentionality. I think back on many conversations that I had with people where I'd take them to breakfast, and I had a certain restaurant, Hagee's. That was my place. If I needed to talk to somebody, I'd take them to Hagee's and we'd get pancakes. And there was a lot of conversations that I had with people where I just said to them, I need you to go down into the trenches with me. I need you to help me. I can't do this on my own. And I often found that when I would talk to people in the church and ask them to do that, they would step up and do that. They wanted to be asked to become partners in ministry. They they didn't want nor expect me to do all of that on my own. So who are the Barnabases in your ministry, the ones that are working beside you? Some of you are in situations where you're maybe a solo ministry in a church, and I've been there. I've been in situations where we've been on a staff with lots of ministry people, and I've been in smaller churches where I was the only pastor, and I know that sometimes that's a very difficult place to be. You feel very alone, but I'm not just talking about people that have titles. And oftentimes the best Barnabases don't have titles, but they have the servant's heart that are ready to roll up their sleeves and work with you. So the question is, when you need to make that phone call, do you know somebody that you can call? And if not, are you seeking out a Barnabas in your life? So it looks like we're on the hour here. So this might be a good breaking point for us, and we can come back and have a little bit of discussion and then continue talking about these different relationships. But Dr. Kingery, if you're with us, maybe we'll take our break here, if that's all right.
Yeah, and I wanted to say something about this Barnabas. I think we can become mutual Barnabas encouragers to one another. And what I have found out in my pastoral ministry, time and again, is if a person who has been a critic of me, if I can counter the criticism with encouragement and do that repeatedly, that person often becomes my greatest encourager. You model it. You model what you want. And so you can become an encourager to another person, and they in turn will become a Barnabas to you. That goes two ways. And I thank you for that. And I think of your illustration of your son and the BB gun is a beautiful illustration. And I had a similar experience, but it was with a it was with a slingshot. And my son wanted a slingshot. And I told him that I thought he was a little too young for a slingshot. But he was making a little money. He worked. We gave him a little money for his working. One day he took off on his bicycle and came back. In spite of the fact that we told him we really didn't want him to have a slingshot, he was so excited about it. He jumped off his bike. He came to me and he said, "Hey, Dad, look what I have." And it was a slingshot. And so I went out to be his Paul, his mentor, and I showed him how to use it. I showed him to be very careful, to look around and make sure that there were no birds, there were no people, there was no one's eye that could be put out. And so I gave him, while I was standing there watching him pull back on his first stone, a bird flew out of the tree. The stone hit the bird and it fell dead to the ground. And he was just completely devastated that he has killed one of God's creatures. So I took him in the house. I continued to mentor him. And I pulled out John Woolman's journal, where John Woolman, for sport, killed a bird. And he felt so bad about all the starving baby birds in the nest. He climbed up into the tree and killed the baby birds right then so they wouldn't have to die a slow death. And I read that to him and I put my arm around him and I said, "Well, we've learned something today." I never saw that slingshot again until many years later when we were cleaning out the garage in a huge box of toys. And he had gone off to college uh, we were we were trying to get the toy box cleaned out, and at the very bottom was that slingshot. He had put it away and never used it again. But he became so sensitive to God's creation of life that it is this is my this is my speculation of the way God used that. He developed a very deep concern for human life and helping humans. And I think that was one thing that led him to medical school and to become a surgeon. And I think God used it that way. And he made a mistake in killing a bird, but I think that so that was that you recall that in my mind as a way that I had poorly mentored my son. But I think afterward I could mentor him after the mistake had been made. So thank you for sharing that. I'm just finding all kinds of examples. I could just keep going for another hour on examples of to exemplify what you're saying. Rusty, this is so helpful. So we'll see you all in just what, 10 minutes? That would be 8:14. Thank you. Rusty, it's so helpful that you've been in the trenches and you know the life of the church leaders. You've been there for many years, and this is so helpful to us. Just your illustrations are so good. So thank you. So we've taken a 12-minute break, and maybe we ought to try to get started again. So let me, before you share your screen, let me make sure we're still recording. Yes, everything's okay. So you can go ahead and share your screen again as you wish.
Okay. Okay, here we go. All right. Well, before I jump back in, let me just give opportunity again. Are there any questions, comments, or insights from the group that you want to share with us? All right. Well, we talked about 2 of the 7 relationships. Everybody needs a Paul. Everybody needs a Barnabas. The third one is, I believe everybody needs a Timothy. Every church leader should have a Timothy in your life. And this is someone that you are discipling. So the mentoring relationship goes both ways. No matter where we are in terms of our church leadership experience, we should all have a Paul that we're learning from and looking to. And we should all have Timothys in our lives that we are intentionally developing as the next generation of leaders. Oftentimes, a Paul in our lives will be older than us, and a Timothy will be younger than us, but not necessarily, not always. But I encourage you, if you can't right now think of the Timothys in your life that you're intentionally raising up and discipling, that's one of the relationships that you need to be intentional about forming as a church leader. So the passage is 2 Timothy 2, 1 through 2, and this is Paul again speaking to Timothy, and this is what he says to him. This is I think a perfect picture of what discipleship looks like between all the way from the mentor down to those that we are mentoring. So Paul says, "You then, my son, be strong in the grace that is in Christ Jesus. And the things you have heard me say in the presence of many witnesses, entrust to reliable people who will also be qualified to teach others." So you get this picture of, okay, well, here's Paul. Paul is developing Timothy. He's teaching Timothy. And then what is Timothy supposed to do? Well, Timothy is then supposed to develop reliable people, Paul says. He's supposed to pour into them to develop them. Well, what are they supposed to do? Well, then they're supposed to teach others. And so it's just exponential. It continues to go. This is what discipleship looks like. This is why we all need a Paul in our ministries, and we all need a Timothy or Timothys that we are actively working to pour into. And so who are the people in your life right now that you have that kind of intentional relationship with? And I'm not, I think the temptation might be for us to say, well, everybody in the church I'm discipling, or everybody in my group I'm discipling. And there is a level of truth in that. But I think we need to go beyond that to the level of relationship. Who are the specific people that God has called you to develop in this way? I really believe that one of the best things that church leaders can do for their churches is to model for them what disciple making looks like, so that they see it. They see the way that it looks when you teach someone how to walk with Jesus. And one of the things that's been helpful for me is the imagery that Dallas Willard uses when he talks about disciple making, and he uses the word apprentice a lot, apprenticeship. And one of the reasons I find that powerful is because sometimes words like disciple or disciple making or discipleship, because we use those words so often in the church, they kind of lose their power a little bit. And they become just sort of just normal language that we use. But when you use a different word, like the word apprentice, it helps you to really see and think about what that looks like and what that means. So, what does an apprentice electrician do? Well, he learns from the master. He learns by watching, right? He spends time with the electrician. He sees how he does things and what he does so that he eventually can do that himself. And David Ferguson, I got this from David Ferguson, who talks about the 5 stages of apprenticeship. All right. I think I spelled apprenticeship wrong there, but he talks about the 5 stages of apprenticeship, and that's been helpful for me to think about what does it look like to help develop somebody into a leader. So, so the first stage, and maybe you've heard this, but it's a good way, I think, for us to conceptualize what this kind of relationship can look like. The first stage, he says, is I do, you watch, we talk. And so think about it in something specific, like perhaps a life group. So the life group that I was telling you about earlier, that's become such an important part of our lives, that life group, when we started it, I was the one that led it. And one of the young couples that was coming to that life group, one of the young men was named Eric, and Eric was a very young Christian. He had a relationship with Jesus, but it was really young, immature. I mean, he had made the commitment several years earlier, but he wasn't raised in a Christian home. He'd never really plugged into a church. But during college, he had made a commitment to Jesus. It was a real commitment, but he just had a lot of growth to do. But as we went in this life group together over the years, we just saw him growing and growing and growing and just really seeking more and more of Jesus in his life. And it got to the point where I really realized Eric needs to be the life group leader, and I want him to lead this group. I want to step out of the way and let him do this. And so we went through these 5 stages of apprenticeship together to help him get to the point where he could be the life group leader. So the first stage, I do, you watch, we talk. And so as I began to talk to him about being the life group leader, this is what we did for a while, is I just continued to lead it, but he was watching, and I was inviting him to watch. This is, watching how I led and what I did and how I said things. And then afterwards we'd talk about it. What went well, what didn't go well, why'd you do this? Why'd you say that? That's the first stage. An apprentice just watches as you do something in ministry. Then the second stage, I do, you help, we talk. So the first stage is I do and you're watching. The second stage is I do and you're helping. And so in terms of the life group, I start to ask Eric to do different things in the life group. So, I was still leading it, but he's helping. Eric, will you lead the prayer time at the end? Or would you lead these questions that we've got out together? And so I'm still the leader, but he's starting to take more and more responsibility. And then afterwards, again, we're talking about it. What went well? What didn't go well? What was the Lord teaching you? And as you were preparing, all those kinds of things. That's the second stage. The apprentice is still watching and learning, but he's also starting to do some of the electrical work himself, right? And then the third stage of the apprenticeship, you do, I help, we talk. So we're already working together, but now it starts to shift where it's not me leading and Eric helping. Now it's Eric leading and me helping. So he's taking more and more responsibility. He's really taking charge of things, and I'm there to help him. I'm not going anywhere, Eric. I'm still here if you need me, and I'm leading certain parts of it. And then afterwards, we're talking again about everything, always talking to each other. And then you get to that fourth stage. You do, I watch, we talk. So after a while, it gets to a point where, Eric, you don't need me. You don't need me. You can do this. You can do the whole thing. You can lead this. I'm going to be there. I'm going to be watching, and we'll talk about it afterwards. And if you have questions, we can go through all that. But now you're the leader. And so you go from you doing and me helping to you doing and me watching. And then you get to that final stage of the apprenticeship where it's you do, someone else watches. Okay, Eric, now who are you going to find to be your Timothy and start the next life group? And, if you think about how effective would the church be if we really took that kind of apprenticeship, that kind of disciple making seriously, to where every ministry is now being multiplied. Every group is being multiplied. Every leader is being multiplied. because we're all seeking intentional relationships with people, with Timothys, that we can develop to take from I do to you do. And now the next stage is you're finding your own Timothy and you're doing the same thing with them. And the more that we learn to do that, and the more that we model that for our church, not only does it multiply the opportunities for ministry within our church, but it makes us much more healthy leaders because we're leading more and more like Jesus. So everybody needs a Paul, everybody needs a Barnabas, everybody needs a Timothy. Who's your Timothy? Who are you developing right now? I know in Eastern region, and I would imagine it's true for most of our yearly meetings, if you're a part of Evangelical Friends or if you're a part of the Friends Church. And even if you're not, it's probably true in your church too. We are at a stage right now where we have lots and lots of our kind of boomer generation pastors that are retiring, lots of them. And we recognize if we don't do better at developing leaders, we're not going to survive. We need to raise up more and more leaders, not just pastors, but elders and Sunday school teachers and youth workers, and all. We need to make leadership development an absolute priority. So who are your Timothys? That's the third relationship. And number 4, every church leader needs a Jonathan. Everybody needs a friend. I don't mean acquaintance. We all have acquaintances and we all have people in the church that we know and that we minister to. But the question is, who are you doing life with? And many times I think that our Jonathans are the same as our Barnabas, but not always. And that hasn't always been the case in my life. But we all need people that we can know and be known by so that we're not living these isolated lives and we're not doing ministry in isolation. We read about the friendship that David and Jonathan had, and you guys are familiar with it, but I'll read it to you again from 1 Samuel 18. It says, after David had finished talking with Saul, Jonathan became one in spirit with David, and he loved David as himself. From that day, Saul kept David with him and did not let him return home to his family. And Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. Jonathan took off the robe he was wearing and gave it to David along with his tunic and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. This is a story of deep friendship between these two men who knew one another, who loved one another. And there is, as I said at the beginning, an epidemic of loneliness, I think, among a lot of church leaders. We have to be intentional about building the kinds of friendships that'll keep us healthy for the long haul. I've been very blessed in the church that I served for many years to have a dear, dear friend that was probably an unlikely friend in some ways. What actually drew us together in that kind of friendship actually was that we had both experienced similar hardships, difficulties in years past that had affected us pretty deeply. And when we out that we shared out pain, it opened up something in a friendship for the two of us. And I remember one Sunday, of all the Sundays that I preached at my church, I always loved preaching. I always loved Sunday morning. I always looked forward to it. But this one particular Sunday, I did not want to be there at all. I didn't want to preach. I didn't want to be at church. I wanted to be home. My wife, the day before, had our second miscarriage shortly after one another. And this one was actually, she'd been fairly far along in the pregnancy. And it was just a difficult day. We hadn't told very many people that we were expecting again because we'd had the earlier miscarriage shortly before that. And so when she miscarried, we were kind of alone in our pain. We were just, it was just us that knew, except for Kyle and Tammy, our friends. We had shared with them that we were pregnant, and so they were aware of the miscarriage. That happened on Saturday, and then I got up to preach on Sunday. My wife stayed home, and I just wanted to be home with her. I was just hurting. I'd gone into my office to get ready for preaching that day early, like I always did. And about 6:30 in the morning, someone knocks on my office door, which is strange because people, service didn't start till 9, so people didn't show up at 6:30 in the morning. But it was Kyle, and he knew that I would be there. And he came. I opened the door, and there he stood, tears in his eyes, and he came to pray with me. He knew that it was going to be a tough day, and he said, "I just want to pray with you." We spent the next 2 hours in my office talking and praying together. And then when it was time, he said, "Let me walk you over to the church." And he did. And I got up and I preached, and no one in that room knew anything about anything that had happened that day except for Kyle. And I often think of that Sunday and how the Lord used this one friend to sustain me and to give me strength. And just as one example of the power that friendship has for ministry, who are your Jonathans in your life that you can identify right now to say, these are the guys that would knock on the door at 6:30 with tears in their eyes to pray for me? We all need those kinds of relationships. And as we talked about at the beginning of our time together, there are so many things in our modern world, especially here in America, that will work against having those kinds of friendships. And there's lots of reasons why having those kinds of friendships are particularly difficult in your own church or in your own community. And maybe you won't find them in your church. Maybe it'll be with another church leader from another community. But you've got to find them, and you've got to make it a priority of your ministry to find them so that you can be healthy for the long haul. Everybody needs a Jonathan. Then number 5, everybody needs a Priscilla or Aquila in their life. Everybody needs a teacher. The question is, who are you learning from? The text is Acts 18:24 through 26, and you know the context. Apollos was a man that had come to Ephesus. He was a very learned man. He was very studied. He was a very eloquent man, a good preacher. He knew about Jesus, but his understanding of Jesus was deficient. And so these two disciples, these two Christians, Priscilla and Aquila, a married couple, took him into their home and explained to him the way of God more adequately, the Bible tells us. They taught him. They just taught him about Jesus. We all need teachers in our lives. It doesn't matter how long we've been doing ministry. When we stop learning, it's time to stop doing ministry. So we ought to never get to the place where we stop learning. Everybody needs someone in your life that you're learning from. Now, a lot of times, again, the Priscilla and Aquila in our lives will be the Paul. It'll be our mentor, but not always. The difference is that when I talk about you need a Priscilla and Aquila in your life, this may be the one relationship that is maybe not someone that you know deeply. It may not be someone that you know well at all. This one relationship is one where I think you need someone in your life that you're learning from so that you can continue to grow as a minister. And that's one of the reasons I love what this Leadership Institute is all about, and that you guys are here. You don't have to be here. I know you're busy. You've probably got a million things that you could be doing tonight, but you've chosen to be here tonight to continue to learn and grow in ministry. And so you need people in your life that are teaching you, that you can receive from. And I would encourage you to make that a priority. If you're not learning, then your people aren't going to be learning. If you're not growing, then the people that you minister to aren't going to be growing. If you're not being stretched in your walk with Jesus, then you're not going to have much to stretch those that Jesus has given to your care. So make it a priority to find relationships with Priscillas and Aquillas that you can learn from. And maybe the context for that relationship is something just like this, where you're able to connect with people who are also learners with you and have that kind of relationship with them. Number 6, every church leader needs an Aaron or a Hur in their ministry. And what I mean by that is you need prayer partners, you need prayer warriors. Who's praying for you? If I were to ask you that today, who's praying for you in your ministry? Could you give me specific names of people that you know are the prayer partners for you in your ministry? So let me read the text for you from Exodus chapter 17. It says, the Amalekites came and attacked the Israelites at Rephidim. And Moses said to Joshua, choose some of our men and go out to fight the Amalekites. Tomorrow I will stand on top of the hill with my staff, excuse me, with the staff of God in my hands. So Joshua fought the Amalekites as Moses had ordered, and Moses, Aaron, and Hur went to the top of the hill. As long as Moses held up his hands, the Israelites were winning. But whenever he lowered his hands, the Amalekites were winning. When Moses' hands grew tired, they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it. Aaron and Hur held his hands up, one on one side, one on the other, so that his hands remained steady till sunset. So Joshua overcame the Amalekite army with his sword. So you guys are probably all familiar with that story. It's a great image of, here's God's people. They're battling down in the valley below them against this Amalekite army. And Moses, their leader, goes up on the mountain in order to pray for them, to intercede for them, symbolized by his hands raised up to the heavens. And every time that Moses raises his hands up in prayer, the Bible says Joshua and his army are winning. And every time that Moses' arms get tired and he drops them, the Amalekites begin to win. And this goes on for hours, so much so that Moses doesn't have the strength anymore to lift up his hands on his own, right? And so here's Aaron and Hur, these two trusted men, and they take a stone and put it down so that Moses can sit down. And then one on one side, one on the other side, they grab his arms, they lift him up, and they hold his hands up so that Moses can continue to intercede for the people and Joshua can continue to win the battle. And we all need, if we're going to be in ministry, we need Aaron's and Hur's in our lives who are lifting us up as we do the work that God has called us to do. I struggled with this and still do. I'll be honest, I struggle with almost everything I'm telling you guys you should do. So I know it's not easy, but I really struggled with this particular one because it struck me in some ways as selfish to ask people to be in a relationship in which I was asking them to pray for me as their pastor. I felt like I should be praying for them, right? I should be the one that's there for them. I should be the one that's lifting up their arms. And of course, that just is a part of the pride that leads us to do ministry in isolation from the beginning. And I was in a class, a DMin class, and my professor was really, really keen on pushing this point home, that you need people in your church who you know are praying for you, and that you are regularly giving prayer points to, so that you know that they're praying specifically for the needs of your ministry. And like I said, I struggled with that. It was hard for me to kind of humble myself or to think that was appropriate to ask people to do that, and but he wouldn't let up on it. And when I finally reached out to a few people in the church, and I spent some time praying about, well, who would I even ask to pray for their pastor, that they would have this sort of prayer relationship with me. I just spent some time praying about it, and the Lord kind of brought some people to mind. And, when I approached them and asked them, would you be willing to pray for me if I were to give you different things of need in my ministry or in the church or the things that I'm doing? Every single one was anxious to say yes. And one of the things that this particular professor had said to me as I was sort of saying, I don't really feel comfortable asking people to do that, is what if God has called these people and equipped these people to be prayer warriors, and they want to pray for you as their pastor, and you're not allowing them to do that because of your own pride? And that was exactly the situation. In fact, some of them said, well, I'm already doing that. I'm praying for you regularly. I've felt the Lord leading me to do that as a part of my ministry, to pray for my pastor. And I'm so glad that you want me to do this now in a more formal way. And I just began to give them some things that they could pray for, and they gladly did that. In fact, one of them started a group that would gather in one of our empty classrooms before the service. And part of what they did is that they would pray for me every Sunday. as I'd go up to preach. And it's a powerful thing to know you've got a room full of praying people for you when you go out to do the work that God has called you to do. The professor that I mentioned to you suggested this book that's on the screen here called Partners in Prayer, which is about exactly what I'm talking about, finding people in your church to serve as prayer partners for you and the ministry that God has called you to do. It's by John Maxwell. It's a helpful book, has a lot of sort of very practical illustrations about this. But we all are like Moses. We don't have the strength to raise our hands in leadership throughout the whole battle. And we need people who are on the sides of us praying to help us. They're doing what God has called them to do to help us to do what God has called us to do. So if I were to ask you today in your ministry, who are your Aarons and hers that are your prayer partners in ministry, would you know? Would you have those answers? That's one of the relationships that we need in ministry. This is one of the stories from that book that I just showed you. It's about Charles Finney. That's a picture of Charles Finney. That's a name that's probably familiar to many of you. He was a well-known evangelist in the 19th century. We may not agree with everything that Finney did or taught, but we can, I think, agree that he was a powerful evangelist in his day, and God used him in very powerful ways. And one of the more well-known revivals that Charles Finney was involved in was in 1830 in Rochester, New York. And the results of that extended revival time was that in a city of 10,000 people at the time, Rochester, there were over 1,000 professions of new faith in Jesus. So 1 out of every 10 people in the city professing faith in Jesus, new faith in Jesus. And in the midst of that, Finney talked about this man named Abel Clary that was his prayer partner, his Aaron, his her, so that when Finney was praying, Abel Clary, or rather when Finney was preaching, Abel Clary was praying. That was his ministry. And so this quote is from Finney. He says, Mr. Clary continued as long as I did and did not leave until after I had left. He never appeared in public, but gave himself wholly to prayer. And you think about what happened there in 1830 in Rochester, 1,000 professions of faith. And I wonder just how much impact this man, Abel Clary, who was never seen in public, had on what happened through the ministry of Charles Finney. So who are your Aarons? Who are your hers? Who are the specific people, relationships in your life that you know you can get on the phone and say, I've got this need. I need you to pray. And you know that they're going to pray for you. Every church leader needs that relationship in his life or her life. And then lastly, number 7, everybody needs a Nathan. And as I think about some of the tragic stories that we've talked about in our 3 classes together and Ravi Zacharias that we talked about tonight, everybody needs a Nathan in your life. This is the person who's going to keep you accountable, the person or people who are going to keep you accountable. The question is, who are you accountable to? And the text is 2 Samuel 12, 1-7, a passage that you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with as well. The Lord sent Nathan to David. When he came to him, he said, there were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him as his children. And his children, it shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over because he did such a thing and had no pity. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. And of course, the story is David, who had not been guarding his own life and his own ministry that God had given to him, had fallen into sin. He had this adulterous relationship with Bathsheba, ultimately leading to the death of her husband and fathering a child, and all this secrecy and all of this sin that David had allowed into his life. And then here comes Nathan. And Nathan has this story to tell, this story that just tears at David's heart, right? It makes him burn with anger. How could this man who had so much sheep, so much cattle, how could he take this poor man's little lamb that he loved so much? And then Nathan looks David in the eye and he says, David, you're that man. You know, you took from Uriah, his wife, you took what belonged to him, you took his life, you have done these things. And then, of course, the result is repentance that on David's part. Who's the Nathan in your life that can look you in the eye and tell you when you need to turn around? Or who can ask you the tough questions that need to be asked from time to time? Who can ask you about your relationship with your wife or your husband? Or who can ask you about your relationship with your kids or your walk with God or the way that you've responded to somebody? Who are the people in your life that you have the kind of relationship with in which you've given them permission to speak that kind of truth into your life? Every single one of us in ministry needs a Nathan in our lives that we would allow to have that kind of authority to keep us accountable. And it can't be nebulous. It's got to be clear that I know who these people are, and I invite these people to have that kind of accountability relationship with me. So those are the 7 relationships that I believe every church leader needs to have, ought to have. And like I said, I hope when we finish up, you can go through those 7 relationships, and with each one, you can give specific names in your own life to say, this is my Paul, this is my Barnabas, this is my Timothy, here's my Aquila and Priscilla that are teaching me, here's the Nathan in my life that is allowed to speak these kind of truths to me when I need to hear them. And I'll just give these to you really quick because I know that we're coming up on the end of our time together tonight. But what can we do then if we recognize we need these relationships, but maybe we're struggling to build them? How can we do a better job of doing ministry in community with other people? Well, here's some suggestions that I'll give to you. Number one, take advantage of local pastoral associations or ministry associations. It may not even be within your denomination, but many communities have opportunities for pastors or church leaders to come together informally or sometimes formally for prayer. Take advantage of those. Find opportunities to be with other people who are in church leadership, who share some of the same struggles that you do, who go through, who are asking the same kinds of questions that you're asking. You may find your Paul, your Barnabas, your Timothy in some of those associations, but you won't if you don't go, if you don't take advantage of it. A second thing would be denominational gatherings. Maybe things like a pastor's retreat or yearly meeting or other opportunities that your denomination or your association of churches makes available for church leaders to come together. Those can be such powerful opportunities for us to build friendships with other people who are doing the work of ministry, to learn from each other, to build strong relationships with others that will fill some of those 7 roles in our lives. So if you have opportunities for things like that, do everything you can to be there and to make those connections. A third possibility I put is remote prayer. And the reason I put that is because that's become such an important part of our sort of connectedness in Eastern region this past year. This actually started because of COVID. When COVID first happened and we were first, kind of shutting our churches down in terms of in-person gatherings, and no one really knew what was going on, and we're trying to get up to speed on technology, and everybody's kind of, just in a panic. we started having these weekly gatherings of our pastors in all of our different regions over Zoom, and we'd invite them to come. And what it became was a time to pray for each other. Now, we weren't doing this before COVID. We actually became more connected because of COVID through these remote prayer gatherings. But we were just gathering every week on Zoom and spending time praying together. And what's happened is that was so meaningful to our pastors and church leaders that they said, well, let's keep doing it. Let's keep having these. We can't always be together. We're pretty spread out, in our region, but we can connect over Zoom for 45 minutes or an hour and pray for each other. And so I know, like Desire and Diodene and some of our other African pastors, we have an African pastors Zoom meeting where we do the same thing. We get online together, we spend some time praying for each other, and you don't need much now to start that. It's pretty easy to start that. Just invite some people to do that. So if you say, well, I'd love to have these relationships, but I'm remote geographically, I'm not near other pastors or church leaders, maybe something like that. A Zoom prayer meeting is a way for you to be intentional about doing ministry and community. Number 4, join a small group at your church, one that you don't lead. So there's all kinds of groups that you're leading. There's all kinds of Bible studies and prayer meetings that you're leading. I'd really encourage you to be a part of one that you're not leading. This is something we actually required of all of our staff members at my last church. You need to be in a life group, and you need to have that connectedness. We want you to have that connectedness. And so if that's available to you in any way, for me, that's been a very powerful thing to be able to connect with other believers and in a small group environment. Number 5, reach out to denominational leaders. Don't do ministry in isolation. If you don't know someone to call, there's people that your church has put into place for you to call. And I'll tell you, they want you to call. And if you don't know who else to call, then reach out to those denominational leaders. Just take that step. Number 6, take advantage of learning opportunities like this. Keep doing stuff like this. Keep going to conferences. Keep making that a priority. Number 7, just take a chance. One of the reasons I think we're so isolated is because we're just not willing to take a chance. And oftentimes when we do, we're surprised by how many people that we thought were maybe much more connected than we feel like we are. We're looking for the same kind of connection and would be glad to have that kind of mentoring relationship or that kind of discipling relationship with somebody. So take a chance and ask someone. So those are just some practical things that I would suggest that we could do. So that's what I've got for you tonight. But I do want to pause again. I've been doing all the talking and you guys have been doing a lot of listening. So what questions or comments or insights do you guys have about this idea of doing ministry in community with other people?
Brad Wood again. I just want to affirm what you've shared, especially like 1 and 2 here on what's on the page right now. They've been a big benefit to me. And you said about intentionally, as a young pastor, those were things that I began to do intentionally that I feel like made a big difference in my life. And I also just want to say, I certainly don't have it all together, and I don't have all 7 people never at the same time, it seems like. So, but I appreciate all you shared, and I just want to affirm that too.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And I am definitely with you in not having it together. Like I said, everything I'm telling you guys you should do, I'm realizing more and more how much I need to do better at each one of these things.
I just wanted to share that I found it helpful, one of your last statements of be involved in something that you're not leading. I think that's very encouraging. We are about to have a gathering with some of our leaders and committee members, and I think I'm going to point that out. That is important because we do find ourselves really being present where we have a certain role, but excluding ourselves when, well, I don't have to lead that particular thing, so I tend to be a part of it. And so then that weekend is also our spiritual walk. It, you know, that we're not just walking out of obligation.
Yeah, thank you for that. Thanks, and thanks to all you guys. Again, I've really enjoyed spending this time with you, and hope that maybe some of it was helpful. And Dr. Kingery, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, this has been extremely helpful. Our life with God, our life with family, our life in community, and these 7 essential relationships. All this is practical. It's helpful. And it's that you speak from your own experience in leadership. And everything you have said, we can apply to our own lives. And that's what we're about at Berkeley College, to be sure that what we teach here can be related to the life and ministry of our students. And you've done that exactly for us. And we're deeply grateful to you, Rusty, especially for this last session when you've had to do so much work while you weren't feeling well. Not only have you taught us ways to achieve vitality and health in our own lives, but you have been serving as our mentor. And we've been watching you and listening to you. And you've given us fresh spirits. Your teaching among us is remarkable, and we are indebted to you, and we thank you again. And now next month on May 3rd, we start a new class on evangelism and outreach. Cheryl White, who is a faculty member at Berkeley College, will be our teacher. She has experience in organizing church evangelism ministries. And so we look forward to that while we say thank you again to Rusty. So let's close with prayer. Majestic God, we've been challenged to be faithful to your call for us to be good stewards, and we know this means good stewardship of our spiritual, mental, emotional, physical lives. Strengthen us to have a stronger life with you, life in community, life with our family. Bless each one in our institute, those present at this time, everyone in our various nations represented in our institute. And as we thank you for Rusty, we ask that you will bring abundant blessings to him and full healing and health. And now we commit ourselves to go forth and proclaim boldly the good news of our risen Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. So we thank you all. What a great 3 weeks, months this has been. And shall we, for years, be indebted to Rusty Savage for what he's given to us. So we'll see you 1 month from tonight. And Rusty, thank you again.